Morning, dear holy brothers and sisters. Thank you for joining us today on our march through the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Today is ER the 15th, May the 16th. Yesterday was Pesach Sheni. Wednesday night is Lag BaOmer. Also in the Chabad world, there's going to be a big simcha because, as you know, the Rebbe in the early 80s, based actually on feedback and inspiration by a Chabad yeshiva that existed in Morocco. And the yeshiva students wrote to the Rebbe that they were studying the Rambam, and they had some kind of, in honor of the Rambam's yard site. You know, Morocco is part of the Sephardic sphere, I guess, and they have a strong affinity for the Rambam. And so the yeshiva students and the community divvied up the Rambam so that they would be studying the entire Rambam. I hope I'm getting this story right. In conjunction with the Rambam's yard site. And the Rebbe always, in his scholarship, like many of the great Talmidei Chachamim, had a great fascination with the Rambam for a number of reasons. The Rambam is the most exhaustive and organized halachic work. And in other words, the other halachic codes exclude what's called Hilchas de Mashiach, the laws that are not relevant in Golus, whereas the Shulchan Aruch, I'm not sure what's going on, why I'm getting blurry, but whereas the Shulchan Aruch,
let me know if I should heat it up.
Whereas the Shulchan Aruch only talks about Golus halacha. Additionally, the Rambam was brilliant in the way he codified and organized and structured his halachas in a very systematic way. And so the Rebbe, sometime following that, based on information that only a tzaddik like the Rebbe could have, he started a campaign to encourage Jews who would heed his voice to study the Rambam. And he said one of the main values is it gives you a proficiency in all of the sugyot, all of the segments of Jewish law. And he encouraged those who had the fortitude to do so to study 3 chapters of the Rambam every day. And by doing that, you would finish the cycle of the Rambam, the entire Rambam, in a little under a year. And so every year there is a siyum, and every year it gets further away from the summer and closer to, because it's not exactly 12 months, it's 11 months and whatever. And so every year it gets a few weeks earlier. So this week with Hashem's help, alongside Lag BaOmer, I believe, I have to check the exact date, there's going to be a siyum harambam. So a lot of big mega Torah and Jewish events are happening this week, which means that there can't be a better time for us to jump right into our Talmud. Presently studying the Shabbas chapter 16, page Kuf Tes Zayin Amud Beis. We depart from our fascinating topic of minim, heretics, maybe early Christians, and their debates with the Jewish scholars and the worthiness of their works, and if it should be saved from a fire or cast into a fire. And we're now going to jump back into our Mishnah and analyze a fascinating fact, which is that you aren't meant to read Kisuvim on Shabbos. What does that mean? Why would there be a restriction against studying from the Torah? I would understand if there would be restrictions on other types of study, but why a limitation on the study of Kisuvim? And so that's where we're going to pick up. And of course, the conversations will continue to be thought-provoking and interesting. And then we're going to start a new Mishnah, and that new Mishnah will allow us the opportunity to revisit some of the unclosed matters that we started talking about in the earlier half of our Gemara. So I'm going to share the screen. We'll get started. And of course, we're going to dedicate today's learning for the good health of the dear members of our Chabura and their households, and prayerful wishes for perfect health for all those who deserve it. I want to mention 2 friends, Leah Basrita, Malka Basrivka, and all others who need an enduring and complete refuah shalema. And so we'll dedicate today's learning in their honor. I'll get the place, bear with me. Here we go. First of all, while I'm scrolling to find the place, I hope you'll take some naches as you see how much of Masechah Shabbos we've done. These are all pages and chapters that we have in our portfolio of Talmud. And here we go. Kuf Tes Zayin Amud Aleph. Let's get the format right. And all right. I'm sorry, Kuf Tes Zayin Amud Beis, 116b. That's why we're Here we go. Here is our Gemara. The Gemara quotes the Mishnah, saying, "Mipnei ma in koyrim." Our Mishnah says, "Why can't you read? Why can't one read the Ksuvim on Shabbos?" And the words the Mishnah use is "Mipnei bitol beis hamedrash," because it'll cause folks to not attend the beis medrash. What does that mean? So Rashi right away tells us, oh, no, I'm sorry. Amarav, Leishanu, when do we say that there is a ban against reading the Ksuvim, part of our Tanakh? It's the part of Tanakh, right? The Ksuvim. So why can't you read it? Or when can't you read it? Leishanu el bizman beis hamedrash. Only at the time of study. In the shuls, in Jewish life, in Bavel, and maybe in Israel too. On Shabbos, there was a dedicated, designated time for Torah study. So during Torah study, when the Beis Medrash is in session, no Ksuvim reading. Bisman, Shaloi Bisman Beis HaMedrash, Kairim. Rav says, but when there is no Beis HaMedrash, you can certainly read Ksuvim. So Rashi explains for us, when is Zman Beis HaMedrash? Kaidam Achila Hayu Darshin. Before the mealtime. So it sounds like, at least at this point, that they would have a Shacharis and on the Shabbos day, and then Torah study session, and then mealtime. And so during mealtime, you want to not eat, you want to read, you want to learn, or you want to learn and eat. At least as far as the Gemara now sounds, according to Rav, there should be no problem with doing so. Why would they stop teaching after mealtime? So it seems like, well, it doesn't seem like. Let's read Rashi. Shaloi bizman beis hamedrash. La'achar achila lo ydarshu mishum shikros. They would no longer give lessons, presentations after the mealtime because of intoxication. As we know, in those days, the wine was particularly potent and strong, and apparently it was not an unheard thing that someone might get a little intoxicated or tipsy during the meal, and they wouldn't have the proper concentration for learning. And so the shir would have to happen before mealtime. Now, you know, there are other halachis that are akin to this. For example, duchening, birchas koyanim, can't be done when a person is intoxicated, which is actually a reason why they should ban Kiddush clubs on Yontif. And in Eretz Yisrael, where they duchen or they do birchas koyanim every day around Shabbos, they should ban it. Maybe they don't have a Kiddush club for that reason. And at least in the Chabad minhag, where they make a Kiddush on Simchas Torah day before Mosaf, they do duchening in Shachris. Right. Because but otherwise, and there's a general presumption that you can't do duchening you can't do duchening when intoxicated, and there's a presumption that there's going to be some intoxication. Now, my example that I just gave is shvach. I'll give you a better example. In Mincha, we don't do birchas koyanim. Why don't we do birchas koyanim in Mincha? Because it's during the day and people might be intoxicated too. And that's why, at least one of the reasons why in Yom Kippur we do the birchas koyanim on, no, I'm sorry, we don't do birchas koyanim, but the Chazan says birchas koyanim by Mincha. And on a fast day, the Chazan says, the birchas koyanim because then there's no intoxication. But anyways, back to our topic. Rav says, you want to read Ksuvim, you want to read Megillas Esther, you want to read Iyov, you want to read, what else is in Ksuvim? Shmuel says, no. Afilu shaloi bizman beis hamedrash ein koyrim. You're not allowed to read from your ksuvim even when the study hall is not in session. Ini, that doesn't make sense. V'narda asrei de Shmuel. We know that the city of Naharda is where they follow the psak of Shmuel. That's where Shmuel lived. V'narda paski sidra b'ksuvim b'mincha de Shabbata. They actually read from ksuvim on Shabbos. And Shmuel is the one that says, "Afilu shaloi bizman beis hamedrash ein koyrim." Itmar hachi itmar. This is how you have to understand the debate. Amarav lo yishanu ela b'makom beis hamedrash. Rav says ksuvim can't be studied only in the locale of a beis medrash, when you're in the shul or in the study hall. But you're allowed to read when there is no in, if you're not in the beis medrash. Rashi shachacham doirish. If you're in the place where there's a shir, don't be reading a novel. God forbid to call ksuvim a novel, but basically you should be listening to the shir. If you're not where there's a shir, go ahead and read Gesundter Heit. Shmuel says, regardless or whether there is a Beis HaMedrash or not, the rule is Bizman Beis HaMedrash. At the time when typically there is studying the Beis HaMedrash, Ein Kayim, you shouldn't study Ksuvim. Shaloi Bizman Beis HaMedrash, but if it's not in the time that this shul is in session or the yeshiva is in session, Kayim, then you can read Ksuvim. Azda Shmuel Itame, and Shmuel indeed follows his psak that it has to do with the time of the shir. Indeed, in the city of Narda, in Shmuel city, they would have a reading, they would have a study session in Ksuvim on Shabbos during Mincha, but you just can't do it during this year.
Rabbi, what's their problem? And if you wanted to study Ksuvim, I mean,
the problem is that you should follow the.
Why do we consider that much lesser?
That's a good question. But the point, first of all, the point is that if there's a shir going on, you should follow the shir.
Yeah. What about a shir on Ksuvim?
So it doesn't sound like there'd be a problem to have a shir in Ksuvim. It just sounds like they don't want you going solo. There's an interesting thing. The Balatanya actually, there's a series of letters. So he encourages that Limud HaTorah should be in shul publicly, be'asara, and he actually calls against those who abandon the group communal study because he has a better topic to explore. So,
Rabbi, did they have multiple minyanim then?
I don't know. The truth is, I don't know a lot about what's going on over here. I'm right now, as we're learning. I mean, when I learned the Gemara before, I remember there's different things, but I want to give you fresh. So let's see.
Rabbi, why did we include it in the canon if we have questions?
We have no problem with Ksuvim. Ksuvim is holy. We're not saying that it doesn't belong in the canon.
If I don't feel it holy from reading this.
No. What we're saying is you got to follow the program. And so if there's a halacha shir, you shouldn't abandon halacha shir to read Ksuvim. I suspect, and I may be wrong, maybe Ksuvim was considered a more simple topic that you could explore on your own. So why would you read something that you can learn on your own at a time where there's a shir on more complex matters that you might not otherwise know? Let me back up here just for a moment. Let me back up for a moment, and then we'll try to give some other explanations. Because Rebel, you're asking a good question, and I want to ask your question in a slightly different, frame it slightly differently, but with the same point, and we'll see if we can get any insight. So first of all, what is the Zman Beis HaMedrash? Rashi told us that Zman Beis HaMedrash was Koydem HaAchila, right? Does everybody agree that is the Zman Beis HaMedrash? So Rabbeinu Chananel writes, on our Gemara, Zman Beis HaMedrash doesn't mean when there is a shir. It means during the time that the Chachamim sit in the Beis Medrash and do their in-depth study. And I guess ostensibly you can seek them out. Shaloi Bizman Beis Medrash means when everybody goes home, which is actually close to Rashi's pshat, right? Rashi says before mealtime, after mealtime. The Ran writes that Zman Beis HaMedrash means all day until mincha, nothing to do with mealtime. The Rambam writes differently. The Rambam says, you know when the sermon was? And this was my impression, by the way. You know when the drasha was? It was after mealtime. It was between, so basically, according to the Rambam, as I recalled, you'd daven in shul, you'd come home and make kiddush and have your soda. Then you'd come back to shul and you'd sit in the shir until mincha time. And so the time of the drasha was after the meal. But apparently there was a wine drinking session after they wouldn't drink so much wine in this first soda, but after the shir, they would have a l'chaim. And so the time to not study is, hold on. Okay, yeah. So the shir would be before they drink, and then they'd have a l'chaim, and then they would no longer be giving the shir. Long story short, there are those that say the Zman Beis HaMedrash is before the meal. There are other commentators who say the Zman Beis HaMedrash is after the meal, and it makes it interesting to decipher. The shaila is Bizman Hazeh, is this rule in force? So the Rambam writes in Hilchos Shabbos. Let's see if they give us the citation here. Oh. Let's read the Rambam's Pshat. Can you read Ksuvim nowadays? And Reb Beryl, are you there?
Yes.
So Reb Beryl, at least
I just pulled out my Tanakh to see why they would even question it. It's
so let's
weird.
read the Rambam.
Okay.
To understand why they banned reading of some af likros. So there, it's a different matter, which we're going to come across soon, I think. Also, likros b'shitrei hadyotis b'Shabbos shaloi kederchol. So first he says, you shouldn't read legal contracts, which you do during the weekday. You might end up editing or whatever. Then he says, also likros b'ksav mahalech tachas atzur v'tachas b'Shabbos. Basically, things that you're afraid you may end up inadvertently editing is a problem. Then he adds a different subject. The af likrois b'ksuvim b'Shabbos, even to read holy scriptures, b'shas beis hamidrash, during the time that there are the yeshiva, the beis medrash is in session. Also, one mustn't read ksuvim. Why? So here is the words of our Gemara. Gezerah mishum mitol beis hamedrash. The gezerah is lest the yeshiva, the people don't come to the beis hamedrash or they don't get involved. And then here is the Rambam's Pshat. Shelo yehi kol echad ve'echad yoshei bebeisai v'koire v'yimona bebeis hamedrash. There's something very, very enjoyable about curling up on your recliner on the couch, especially when it's cold. You could sit near the fire with a warm blanket and read Ksuvim. That would be more interesting. But what would happen is people would not show up to the beis medrash, and they wouldn't learn whatever the important matters that are being shared publicly, if it was matters of halacha or other sugyas. And so the Rambam says, by putting Ksuvim on the blacklist, it ensured that people went out to shul and they were able to learn. It sounds like Ksuvim in the times of the Gemara and the times of the Mishnah were just about the exclusively, or at least exclusive, prevalently available reading material. And so we didn't want people to be distracted by reading even holy material and fail to go to shul, fail to study Torah. This is the Rambam's explanation. And so the Rambam, based on this reading, would tell you that even Bizman Hazeh, you shouldn't read Ksuvim if it is the time that there is a shir, because it may be an incentive to stay home.
Sorry, Rabbi. It just I can't just grasp it. It doesn't make any sense. If you're in a shir, you shouldn't be reading anything else of any kind.
Nachon, that's obvious. The problem is Ksuvim is holy. And so people will feel justified to have a holy alternative to the shir.
And what about Nevi'im? Is studying the Chumash, and somebody who wants to study Yecheskel or whatever.
So in the time where there was so here's the thing, we have to understand that today's society is structured differently than it was once upon a time. In the time of the Rambam, in the time of the Mishnah, in the time of Neharda, it was, in a sense, it was communally and politically like a shtetl. There was one program, and everyone came to shul, and the Rav gave all the halachas, and there was less written material. So if you wanted to learn more knowledge, Torah knowledge, you needed to go to shul, right? Remember, almost everything is oral. But it would be a whole lot easier not to go outside and have to bundle up and walk in the mud to your shul. And so there is a holy alternative. People would take it. And so therefore, it sounds like the Chazal made regulations to ensure that people would not take the easy way out, and they would be more engaged in the Torah study and engaged in a communal process. The Baal Amar and others write that nowadays there are so many shiurim. Every Shabbos there's a drasha. I'm sorry, now that there isn't this formalized presentation, there's a sermon. That's not a drush. We're talking about a long shir. And there's a diversity of shiurim, but there isn't that one central shir. So at least the Baal Amar writes that nowadays you could read anything as long as it is kadosh. So again, as far as halachically today, is there any restriction to reading? Is there any restriction to reading Ksuvim? It doesn't sound like it. But once upon a time, it was a serious matter. Reberel asks a question. Aminut. You know what else is very interesting, like Suvim, and maybe even more interesting? Nevi'im. You ever read the book of Yeshua or Shmuel or Melachim? It reads better than the best novel. It's holy, but it's also interesting. So why weren't the Chazal afraid that people would pick up a Navi? Why were they only worried about picking up a Ksuvim?
Exactly.
So the Meiri writes, you know why they didn't make such a restriction? Because the drashas were very much comprised of excerpts from Torah and Nevi'im. And so the study of the Torah and Nevi'im would be a good chazar, a good preparation. Whereas Ksuvim was off topic. There's another answer which I think might come with a different take on our mission entirely, which is very simply. So again, put that aside. So I gave you an answer. Nevi'im and the Torah were part of the topic that was discussed. Apparently, Ksuvim were less discussed. Why? I don't know. And so therefore, they didn't want them reading it. Now I want to give you a different shot that was based on Rashi in the beginning of our Mishnah. Simple. You know why they didn't ban reading the Torah? Because we read the Torah in Shul, and that would be a big problem to ban reading Torah. You know why we don't ban Nevi'im? Because we read Haftorah in Shul. It would be highly problematic to ban one of the central works and one of the center pieces of the Shabbos program. Ksuvim, for whatever reason, never trickled into the Shabbos service, and so therefore it wouldn't be such a problem, and it wouldn't, at the very least, trigger a degree of cognitive dissonance. You're telling me I can't read the work that you just read in Shul, and so at least Ksuvim, so they thinned out the choice of reading material. I'll tell you the truth. What I just said now, I think follows a different take on the Gemara. It's probably less in the ballpark. It relates less to what we're reading over here, but I wanted to share that with you just for the fullness of this topic. Rebero.
I would turn this whole thing on its head. That Ksuvim was so interesting, etc., that people would stay away from shul just to read it.
Yeah. Let me give you a final thought. Maybe the question here is different. The Chazal made a gezerah, not to read Ksuvim. There are those who explain our mission as follows. There was a svara. There were a group of people who approached the rabbis. Hey, rabbis, I've got a great idea. You know, in Shul, we read the Torah. And that's how we become well-versed with the Torah. You know, we have a good degree of familiarity with the prophetic, with the Navi themes because of Haftorah. But we don't really have a lot of exposure to Ksuvim. And maybe there was a limit of works of Ksuvim. Could we, after the Haftorah, have a second or third reading from Ksuvim? That would really help us know Ksuvim. And the rabbi said, you know what? We're not going to do it, although it's a great idea. Because then there'll be no time for the communal shir afterwards. So that might be another way to understand the Mishnah. I don't think that's the Gemara's pshat, but that would be another way to understand our Mishnah. Why didn't they establish a limud of Ksuvim like Torah and Haftorah from Torah and Nevi'im? Because Bittul Beis HaMedrash, then the program would be too long, and there would never be a chance to have the shir, which was to convey the themes of the Torah Shabbal Peh, I suppose. And there you have it.
Rabbi,
yes, Professor, please.
one of the arguments here is the degree of familiarity of different segments of the Torah, which we are gaining during sermons.
Yes.
But I think that our knowledge of prophets is extremely scant
Today.
At least those segments that are read during the services. It's just, a little glance that doesn't do justice to the depth of the rest of the prophets. How can we argue that we are familiar with the prophets because of the what we read in the services?
Rabbi, it's very
Hold on, Professor. Here's what I would say. Briefly, I think in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara.
Maybe you'll answer both. You can answer both at the same time. If we really wanted to know the Nevi'im, we would read a different Haftorah, not every week the same few Pesukim.
So what I was going to say was a little different. Professor, you make a good point. What I suspect was the case is that in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, they were extremely well-versed in the teachings of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. That was probably the thing they knew well. What they didn't know well was the matters of the oral tradition, where you had to be enrolled in one of the academies and give up 10 years of your life to commit to memory a solid segment of the oral tradition, and then you would know the Torah Sheba'al Peh. So in those days, in that society, it was of graver significance to preserve time for people to have exposure to the drasha, which probably included matters of the oral tradition. Ironically, today, and when I say today, I mean the last 200-300 years, the yeshivas turned everything on their head for whatever reason, where there's a lot of knowledge, relative knowledge, or exposure to the Torah Sheba'al Peh, which now is written down. And ironically, there's very little attention certainly in the non-Israeli yeshivas. In Eretz Yisrael, thankfully, they've restored this proficiency of the Tanakh. I'm not sure if that's the credit of the yeshivas or Israeli society, but other than that, today, most yeshivas are non-profit institutions. Okay, the Dr. Hammer, bevakasha.
Yeah, first of all, I apologize. I had to leave for a phone call. So this is a quick comment, and I'm not sure if you want to pursue it now. It had to do with the drinking and duchening. And okay, and it seems to me that's certainly a legitimate issue. So why do they allow people, why isn't there an issue about drinking in general on Shabbos until a certain time, until you finished all the davening from Musaf and That's number one. Number two, I never thought of the Simchas Torah issue because my interpretation was much more involved with the reality that when you have a large synagogue and no matter how many Sifrei Torah, people are going to have to stick around for like 2 hours to get in the Liyah, unless you're a Kohen or a Levi, then you could, you're lucky. So the question is to get the largest number of people involved with duchening. It makes sense to
That's
do
very
it.
interesting. So you're saying it was a logistical matter,
Right.
where if you want everyone duchening together, you better do it in Shacharis because you're
Right.
going to lose people, and
Right.
also
You'll
there'll be
lose
breakaway fragmented minyanim. You know what?
Exactly.
I hadn't considered that,
Yeah.
but I suspect there's real truth to that.
Yeah.
Shkaya for sharing that.
Right.
As to the first matter of drinking, it's a good point. It's a good point.
Yeah.
And we'll leave it at that. I think many rabbis
Tolerate it for
fire 1, 2, 3 shots, and then they say better tov shiyu shogim and value mezidim. But
It's a controversy ad hayom hazeh.
I'll tell you this: it doesn't make sense to me, even though it happens in our show a little bit. It doesn't make sense to me, and to me, there's a few different traditions that have trickled into Jewish society that don't make sense. And I think the popularity is directly correlated to its inappropriateness. And I wouldn't get up and show and say this, although maybe I should, but there is a prevailing custom today. It didn't exist even when I'm a young guy. It didn't really exist even when I was in yeshiva. But today in a lot of the communities, there's something about a pre-Shabbos Kiddush.
Yeah.
Maybe you haven't even heard of it, and then good for you.
Yeah.
There's this prevalent thing where people before davening say, before Friday night,
Right.
before going to shul, say l'chaim and whatever. They even have a name for it. They call it bein hashmashas because it's occurring in the time that precedes the onset of Shabbos, and sometimes, God forbid, even during when it's already Shabbos, or maybe they make Kiddush. And I think my theory is that probably in some of the camps, some counselors clandestinely, which again, I don't think this is a good idea either. They were having l'chaim so that they would be in the zone for Friday night, because the camps, all the camps like to make l'chadodi and then the meal very, very lebedik. And for whatever reason, the counselors felt like they needed to take some alcohol. Then those counselors grew up and they said, wow, we love this addiction thing. Let's make it a mitzvah. And I have a feeling that's how it started. And it's going to become one day, there's going to be halachic works written about the holy origins of this minhag. And the same thing, I think, with the Kiddush Club, the people that didn't want to listen to the rabbi's sermon, or they didn't have patience for the Haftorah, which is shocking. I'll tell you what happened in our shul. People would go out. I told them, I'll make a deal with you. You don't have to be there for the sermon, but you may not start during the Haftorah.
They do. They go out before that.
Right. So anyways, but that was...
They go out during Torah reading, not only the Haftorah.
Yeah, but particularly Haftorah. You see in Exodus, even some of...
I don't know if I got in late, so I don't know if Bernie told you, but in our shul in Tina, it was for years we did that, and then the rabbi put down the
I'm
law
not connected
that
well, so I'm not sure if you could hear it.
and then what happened was, so people couldn't do it in shul anymore. They would walk out and go across the street to a balabais who lived next, just across the street from the shul, and did it over there.
So from here we see the Mesirat Nefesh for a Jewish minhag. No, I'm kidding.
Oh.
Anyways,
Rabbi, since we're OT off topic, I came in late, so I apologize. But remember on Friday we discussed the parable with the donkey and the lamb.
Yes.
Representing the Galus and the Mashiach.
Yes.
And I asked the question, who's the judge who takes the bribe? So I thought about it, and I have a possible answer that I thought of, that in my opinion, works for me.
Hashem is the judge?
No,
Okay.
That would be the wrong way to go.
Right, that's why I was curious. No, so share, please.
No, so in Jewish history, kings, monarchs, noblemen would invite the Jews in to their communities, kingdoms, to help financially, start economics, boost up economics and all that. And that was the bribe. And the unwritten agreement was, we will protect you and you will help us economically. And then they would take loans, large loans from rich Jewish merchants, and either for financing their campaigns, military campaigns, or sustaining their courts, then eventually not paying them back because those loans became quite large, and eventually allowing the population to have pogroms and kill Jews, and eventually expel and exile them. And in my opinion, that's the possible judge who takes the bribe and then doesn't deliver.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Or we could say the judge is kind of like the reality of the situation. But I that's very interesting what you said. Thank you for sharing that. All right, so we're talking back to our Gemara. We have a machlokes Rav and Shmuel, and we're not sure what they're arguing about. Either they're arguing about if you may learn at the time of the shir or the entire Shabbos. And then we said maybe the argument is where there is a base medrash, or if you could study in the base medrash and out of the base medrash. Again, right? If you're in the base, if you're by a base medrash, let's see how Rabbi Steindl translates it. Or in a shtetl where there's a base medrash, you got to go to the base medrash. But if you're staying in an Airbnb in the middle of nowhere and there's no base medrash, well, then at least you should read Ksuvim. Now the Gemara and Shmuel says no. Whether there is a base medrash, whether there isn't a base medrash, there is a blanket regulation opposed to reading Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. Let's just see one thing. Shmuel says, Bizman Beis HaMedrash Ein Kerm. Shle Bizman Beis HaMedrash Kerm. So Rav says the location of a base medrash, and Shmuel says during the base medrash. And the Gemara points out that in Arda they indeed would study ksuvim as part of the session. Rav Ashi disagrees and says, "L'olam kidamor mikara." Go back to the original reading that Rav says, "Bizman of the shiur, bizman hameis medrash," and Shmuel says to Rav, "Ushmuel Rabbi Nechemia." Shmuel follows the viewpoint of Rabbi Nechemia. How so? Because Shmuel is the one who says you can never study ksuvim during the meal, after the meal, as Rashi says, before you're drunk, after you're drunk. And Professor, Dr. Stelma, I just want to throw in that unfortunately or fortunately, the Kiddush Club was on topic, because the Gemara talks about, at least according to Rashi, how there was a certain point where you were allowed to read ksuvim because there was no shiur, because the people were drunk, because they would drink, according to Rashi, in mealtime. According to the Rambam, they had a special l'chaim session after the shiur. Anyways, but Rav Ashi says Shmuel does give a blanket restriction against reading ksuvim. Here's the thing. There's a brisa that says like this. Although we said that kisvei hakodesh ein karim b'hem, there is no haftorah. I think that's pshat over here. There isn't a formal kriya. But we do study and discuss them. Maybe you're allowed to check it out if it comes up in the topic during a drasha. Rabbi Nechemia says, what is the reason why we limit the study of ksuvim? Rebera, listen carefully, because this might support your initial assertion. We want the people to appreciate how important it is not to be reading mundane material. People are going to say, Kisvei kodesh ein kairim. The Chazal even don't allow reading holy works. Now we understand how important it is not to read mundane texts. The Chazal and the Jewish law makes Shabbos so significant. They even restrict holy readings. It's just not holy enough. Rashi, Reb Nechemia, Amar Lemil say, the Leislei Tama, then Karmishon Bittel, Elo Kadeshim Kalvachem. Reb Nechemia and Shmuel say the reason not to read ksuvim is just to help people appreciate how important, how significant, and holy Shabbos is. It's not about Bittel Beis HaMedrash. It has to do with the Kalvachemer that we said over here. Koirim v'shainim. So interesting. What does it mean? Avol shainim b'hem? Rashi says, "Kigayin medrash or ashirim v'kehelas." Because the reality is that in shuls, we do sometimes study or read in part of the liturgy shir ashirim, kehelas, tehillim. So you can read them. You could study. You could teach them or read them, but not. It shouldn't be a limud iyuni. I think that's pshat. Let's see.
Okay.
No, I got it wrong.
I have to.
Join him. Hold on. Here's the brisa. Ein karim b'hem. You don't do a comprehensive reading. Avol shainim b'hem v'darshim b'hem. A teacher can give them as the basis of a presentation, a medrash. Reb Nechemia says the reason why it's prohibited is to magnify the significance of Shabbos. Reb Beryl, how do you feel about this?
No, but Rabbi, for me, it opens up a whole other area. Like, is there a discussion of how we determined which Haftorah to read and why, and what's the purpose, as the professor said? If the purpose would be to go through the Nevi'im, we should do it like we do the Torah, read a different part all the time until we go through all of it. So I'm way off somewhere else with another problem.
So first of all, it's an interesting point. The reason for the Haftarah was not really Navi literacy. It was about having readings that are along the lines and a related theme to the Torah reading.
By the way, are there discussions? Does everybody agree automatically from the beginning, or were there discussions we should read this rather than that?
There is some discussion about which Haftarah is read. The origin of this discussion is in the Gemara. I think in Maseches Megillah, if anyone recalls.
Anyway, it's a whole field, but it's very interesting. I haven't thought about it much, but the professor piqued my interest because he was calling it the Reader's Digest version of Nevi'im.
Yeah, it's selected readings. It doesn't really give you a proficiency of Navi. It gives you an exposure. And in one of the problems, for example, in the Haftorah, it's not a problem, but the reality is that you don't get the full picture because a lot of times it starts in the middle of a story, it ends in the middle of a story. But it was meant to be themes related to the parsha.
Rabbi, when we look at anything in the Talmud, how many discussions this way, this city, that city, I can't believe that something similar didn't go on to determine which Haftorah to read.
It did. Just we can't learn the whole Gemara on one foot. We're going through it step by step. So we will get to those Gemaras too. Yeah.
In addition, what we read on Yom Tovim could be a whole year of study.
Yeah, it is. And sometimes I get up in shul and I say, Rabbi Isai, today you're lucky you're in a Chabad shul because the Chabad meaning follows the shorter version. And then sometimes I'll say,
on the tradition of the Jews.
How about the Sephardic version?
Sometimes I say, Chevra, I hate to break this to you, but we're taking the Sephardic tradition. We're reading the longer Haftarah. But there's more.
Rabbi, one Shavuos, David and I came. We were down in Florida, and we came to the shul, and all of a sudden, there's something going on that they missed Ruth. They didn't read Ruth, so it turns out that we didn't know that in Chabad shuls and other Hasidic shuls, people don't read Ruth, and we were like, I've never heard of that.
Yeah, so, we follow the minhag HaGra.
Yeah.
I think the Gra's minhag is not to read the Megillas in shul.
Okay.
It happens sometimes.
I'm going to have to leave you. I'm going to try to come back. Let me see what I tell them on the other side.
Beryl, we hate to see you go.
I'm not so sure, but we'll have a vote on that.
All right. Interesting. I don't know if you noticed, but I was like stammering or stuttering over the translation of the word shoinim bahem. I wasn't sure what it was. I said, and I wanted to look into Rabbi Steinsaltz. Does it mean to read or to have it in a medrash?
Study it, to learn it.
Right. No, but I was trying to understand what the Gemara's pshat. Rashi says, and I even explained it wrong when I read you Rashi the first time. I think he means that there are famous medrashim, like Medrash Shir Asher Mekahalas. And that's an instance of a medrash based on a work of Ksuvim. Others. Oh, Dr. Stammer, we have you on 12. Okay. The Rambam seems to think shoina means, like the doctor originally said, it's an in-depth, it's a limud iyunis, as opposed to just a peripheral reading. So then that's not studying it as a text, as a story, but more as a limud. The bottom line here, based on this Gemara, is that the Chazal want to underscore to us how important it is to spend Shabbos in a proper way, to the point of saying that you can't even read certain Ksuvim, not because they aren't holy, but to help people realize that even holy readings are restricted to be appropriate. We said over here, Kol Shekain b'shitrei hadoita is to read simple contracts. Rashi on that word, shitrei hadoita, says, Oy igrois hashluchois limtzoi chayfetz, letters, correspondence. Tosfos takes exception to that translation. Pirush by contrast, igrois, v'tema. Tosfos says the reality doesn't match this interpretation. The nagu ha'olam likreis b'ksav, the igrois hashluchim makom l'makom l'talt l'madish. Says people read letters. The near l'read the like kari shitrei hadoitos al shtari chayvas. So Reese says we're talking specifically about contracts, not letters. Aval igrois shari. You're allowed to read a letter. Sometimes a letter arrives that says you need to run and send a doctor, or you need to pay help us raise money to ransom this guy, or he's going to otherwise be killed, or whatever else. Whatever The Rebbeinu Tam says, even if it's not Pikuach Nefesh, you can still read it. You know what's inside it. And if you know it, you can read it. If you don't know it, Shamish Beitzarech Al Pikuach Nefesh. Because of Yerushalmi, they come from Ma In Kern Bekis HaKodesh, Bnei Shitra Yed Hashem Atam Lo Yishu Motor Afim Hu Omer Bekach, Mezem Shtori Mashma Dafka Kin Chavis. And the Yerushalmi clearly also indicates that it's talking about business. B'chim Pirush Rashi L'Kamen Gam Exer Shel Ikar B'Shtori Had Yotos to B'Shtori Mekach O Memkar Kamar B'Chen Egia Pirush B'Ksav Yodai Umi Oisem L'Chametz Aksov Melaz. The other Rabbeinu Yehudas. Interesting. Although we're saying that you're allowed to read letters, I think he's saying novels, books that describe war. Sefer Milchama. Hang on 1 second. What's a Sefer Milchama?
A newspaper.
No.
I'm talking about today's world.
Oh, Josephus, he says. Something like Josephus. And actually, now I'm thinking about the Shulchan Aruch actually quotes Josephus. Not quotes, mentions Josephus and other such works. So Tosfos says, Mio, even though we're saying you're allowed to read letters, Milchames like Suveis Belaz, written in German or in French or whatever, near the Rabbeinu Yehuda the Asr Leibhem, the Loi Garim Yehud Tanya B'Perik HaShoyel, B'Perik Shoyel Kosav, Shetachas Hatzura V'Adiegna Asr Likras B'Meshabas Afil L'Chol L'Yother. Anyways, long story short, according to Tosfos, and this is one of the interesting things that Tosfos frequently does for us. Rashi seems to be teaching the Gemara in the abstract. Help us understand the Gemara. Tosfos, on occasion, helps us synthesize the pshat of the Gemara with reality. And so here there's a reality that in Lamaisa, people following Jewish tradition were reading letters. And so I don't think he's not changing pshat in the Gemara because of the reality, but he is telling us that in reality one could read these letters, and there is a big move in the Bali Tosfos to permit it. First of all, pikuach nefesh, and second of all, whatever. But there are things that you can't read: legal documents and novels, war dramas, or war. So. That's an interesting Tosfos. So there you have it. The Rashba. Apparently, there may have been places that there was a minhag to read Ksuvim as a haftorah of sorts. That's what I'm picking up from some of the commentaries here. Remember, today in those days, they didn't have text messages or emails. So all you had was a letter, and it could be a guy came to the town right before Shabbos, and he had a letter from your cousin from the town next door, urgent letter. And so it was much more likely that there was this need, and much more common that people didn't just stop write a letter. They wrote a letter if there was something of grave significance. And it's interesting how Tosfos gives us a little taste, a little flavor of what life must have been like. Now, granted, people wrote letters up till 20. I mean, some people still write letters, but everyone wrote letters until about 10, 15 years ago. Today, it's becoming in the younger school age a lost art. So it's very interesting. You know, it's interesting, Dr. Hammer. What do you think, or Professor Stammer too? You know what a pashkevil is? And in Yerushalayim, they slap up before Shabbos these long. Give me a good English word for a pashkevil.
Statements, or actually, many times it's denouncements.
Yeah, the announcements. So I wonder if you could read those on Shabbos. I'm going to
But
suspect
then
that
I would put this under Lashon Hara.
I have a feeling the Neturi Karta permit reading it on Shabbos.
I don't. What about pasting it to the walls?
That you can't do on Shabbos.
But people used to, Rabbanim, there was Shelot and Chuvot that Rabbanim and Kehilas would write, and Igrot that Rabbanim would write to different Kehilas.
Right?
I would assume those you could read.
Yeah, that's Torah, L'chor, that's Torah study. So the question that's asked in the 1700s is, okay, Tosfos says that you shouldn't read not novels, but, or I should say fiction, non-fiction works. You shouldn't read memoirs about the, I don't know, about the foreign affairs, whatever. That seems to be what Tosfos is saying. This is a Gemara session. This is not a no psak zone. But the question asked in the 1700s, or the 1600s, there was a proliferation of newspapers. Now today, a newspaper that was printed last night is already obsolete. But in those days, a newspaper for the first 3-4 weeks had a lot of significance. I guess facts moved slower then. So he asks, are you allowed to read the news parts of the newspaper that talk about matters of war? And I should add one more thing. In those days, it was important to know about a war, just like today. Well, because if a war is breaking out in your zone, you might need to know if you need to evacuate. So it's not all just hypothetical. And who knows better than the Jewish people, but having to, make a last minute decision if you're going to run away or move from the front or whatever. So it wasn't entirely academic. We daven that these things should all be academic for us. Except for how could it be academic when we have Yidden in Eretz Yisrael and there's news that affects our flesh and blood and our our land. But anyway, so he asked this question. So he writes, one of the Shalot Chuvot writes, and the Shalos Yavet says, that's not part of this prohibition. Because that's just like a letter that you don't know what's inside the letter. You don't know the news.
Rabbi.
Yes. Certainly during war, he says you need to have access to this information. You need to know which side is winning. Sometimes it could be a matter of pikuach nefesh. Or maybe you have business affairs and the economy is about to tank.
Rabbi,
go ahead.
If we're talking about what was going on in those days, there were people who couldn't read. So what if somebody comes to you with a letter and asks you to read it for them?
Interesting. That's an interesting question. I don't know. You probably couldn't do it for pay.
You can always say nicht on Shabbos gerät.
No, the question is there an aver in listening?
Interesting. All right, Chaval, you see, I told you it'd be an interesting, Dr. Hammer, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to bring up the issue of in shul, people, often people who are quite well educated, the sheets that they, copied to share it with you, either during laning, during davening, or somebody will open up a Gemara during any time, and that's pretty prevalent. I mean, it goes along. That's not the Kiddush Club group, but it's another group of usually very learned, well-educated people who perhaps, getting back to Reb Beryl's issue about Ksuvim, might be more interesting. They have a more fascinating issues that they want to share with others during that holy time. So I'm just
interesting
whether or not that's
so. Doctor, there's two comments that I hear in your words. Yeah. Number one, is it acceptable to read those things during davening? But your main issue, I think, or your main comment is verbally sharing those wonderful chidushim at a time where it's distraction or not the primary program. That's a very interesting and good question.
Not even verbally, just handing them.
Okay.
So, here, you got anything for me? There are certain friends that I had. they read certain things, and during the week, and they'd compile them, and they'd give them out, and etc. So
Look,
Reading material. Interesting.
there's several Orthodox rabbis in Montreal who, for the sermon, put out 6 or 7 books on the tish on which to continue with their sermon. Open them up, look for the page, and not always in Hebrew, sometimes in English reference. Absolute Orthodox shuls.
uh,
You're saying a rabbi might be reading a source material for a sermon during davening? Is that what you're saying?
No, as part of his sermon to quote, he wants to quote somebody. He has the book there and
Right.
reads from the book. I don't know why there wouldn't even be a consideration of our Gemara there.
Well, what would be wrong with that? It's Torah. Oh, you're saying during davening?
Well, he has books on there that are English. That are
Well, the problem is not English. The problem is the content. You're saying if the prohibition against ksuvim today, you know what? Let me see if I can get some more material. We'll take a look in the Shulchan Aruch.
That's why I think suvim is a perfect word. Writings. It's a big category.
Bli neder.
Yeah.
We'll just take a dive into the Shulchan Aruch just so we could see like the modern application of ksuvim in today's day and age. I showed you the Rambam, but let's see if we can. Anyways, my dear friends, have a wonderful day. A big Shabbos Ch to everyone for making this, as always, an enlightening, informative, and expansive discussion. And we again daven for everyone's well-being. And I hope to see everyone tomorrow. Be'ezer Hashem. Thank you all. Shabbos Ch.
How was your conference? I never got to ask you.
Baruch Hashem. Thank you for asking. And it's good to be back, though, as usual. All right, I'm going to let Shalom begin the Chumash in just a moment.